Now what's going on?
I don't know.
Okay,
It didn't start yet.
That the meeting is being recorded.
I need to find myself a mute.
Mute top left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner of the Zoom box.
Mine was on the bottom left, but I'm good.
Helps if I turn my camera on, huh?
Hi, Susie.
Hi, Mary.
How are you?
Good. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm too short for my
Hello.
camera.
Hi, Susie. You gotta get a pillow like me.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm gonna have to adjust this. You don't need to see me anyhow. There we go. So I have Linda Mulligan here with me too. Good
There's no
morning,
credits, so
everyone.
it's kind of, you don't have to worry about signing in or anything like
Oh, good.
that.
I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, you're all
over,
good to
Linda.
go.
Ala
Linda,
and
can you
Dash
see
are
the
supposed
light
to
up
come
on this
too.
side? It's awful bright with everything on. Thank you.
Hi, Loretta. Hi, Jennifer.
Good morning.
How's everybody doing?
Good. Awesome.
I'm good.
Good morning.
Dawn doesn't have her thing
Hi,
on.
Anthony.
Good morning.
Anthony, good morning. Thank you.
Hi, James.
Good morning, Barbara. Good morning, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, James.
How is everyone this morning?
Good. How are you?
Good, good, good. Glad to be here. Anthony, thank you so much again. We appreciate you taking the time to
Absolutely.
assist us in this.
Yeah, no problem. I'm doing these for, well, probably about a month straight. So, well, better to get the correct information out there than if people get the wrong information. You know,
Absolutely.
Yes.
Right.
makes all of our jobs easier.
Absolutely. Hi, Joe.
Hello. Barbara.
Try to look.
Like you behind me though. No. Come this up, come over here. This, Tommy, are you okay over there?
Mary, you have to make me a co-host so I can
Yep.
share my presentation. I just went to check. That's why I'm saying it.
There you go.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Good
Better
morning.
do it. Yeah, I did the last one. I'm like, I can't share. Oh, hold on a minute. We don't need any more delays today. It's a Friday. No one wants to be stuck on a Zoom call all day. I understand that. And at the conclusion of this, I get to pack for vacation. So,
Good for
Oh,
you.
good.
yeah, nothing wrong with renting a cabin on the lake for a week and just putting your feet in the sand with your dogs. You know?
Nice.
Yeah, it helps. Trust me.
Dogs are a man's best friend.
And I have 3 best friends.
Oh, God. I have a blind one here. He's blind and hard of hearing, and he's 16.
Yeah, I had one of those too, where you literally had to let her know you're in the room because she didn't know it.
Exactly.
But once you did, she was your best friend.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. But I'll tell you, despite that, when we used to take her on vacation, she since passed, but she would go right into the water, even though she couldn't see it. She didn't care
Yes.
as soon as she heard the waves lapping up on the beach, she'd run toward the water. And I'm like, wait, don't run too far because,
Yeah.
I don't want to
They
have to come
know.
get you. Yeah.
They definitely know. This one knows the in and out, how to get in, how to get out, all around. He uses half of my kitchen as a guide, for him.
Yeah, that was the thing. We couldn't like rearrange anything when we had her. We had to keep everything
Right.
where it was. If we put like a box down or something, she'd run into it. So we had to be, extra careful not to impede
yeah.
her normal routes of,
Right.
yeah.
Was she diabetic?
No, she ended up dying of kidney failure.
Oh, mine is diabetic.
Yeah, but I mean she was 14. That's, for
Yeah.
a big dog, that's old. So
Oh, for a big dog, yeah. This is a little Yorkie Bichon. He's 16.
oh no, she was a husky shepherd mix.
Yeah, yeah.
She was a big girl,
Oh,
but that's why we have them.
yeah, you're right. Because we love them.
Yeah. Plus, especially I don't have any children. So those are my children. As you can imagine how spoiled they are.
Well, my kids are grown, and he's still spoiled.
Yeah.
At least these children listen to you. Not you.
Well, they listen to me so long as they know there's still biscuits on the counter.
Right? You're right.
It really helps having a dog that's food motivated,
Oh, God, I know. They gave this one a certain kind of food, and I never thought he would eat it because I was giving him gourmet and all kinds of. He eats it like he could eat it all day long. He's so food motivated.
Yeah, that is extremely helpful.
Yes, it is.
Except my dogs know literally when it's 5:30 at night when they get their dinner, they come to me. They know it's 5:30, so they start bugging me, and I'm like, "How do you know it's 5:30? Like you can't even read the clock,
Well, he's supposed to eat every 12 hours, so he eats at dinner at the 10th hour. He comes, like you said, 5:30, 6 o'clock. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, they're on top of me. They're taking their paws. They're swatting me with their paws. I'm like, I know what you want. Let me just hold on. Wait till the commercial so I can,
I know.
Nope. Now the funny thing, since we're talking about dogs, I'm sorry. Now every time the doorbell rings, they run to the door because they think it's DoorDash.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah, well, my wife would get a burger for me, a burger for her, we get a burger for the dogs. So now every time the doorbell rings, they think it's their food coming from DoorDash. It's hilarious.
That's so cute.
Yeah, the UPS guy doesn't think so though, because he has three dogs barking at him at the door,
I can imagine, right?
and he's not the one bringing food, so he's not their popular person.
Oh, wow.
But it is what it is. So they bring joy and happiness to their owners, and that's all that matters.
They certainly do.
Mary, what was your count for today?
I had like 46 people. Right now we're at 42.
Oh, good. Nice small class. I did 300 yesterday.
Oh, that must have been fun.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be because there's only so many questions you can ask. So it's not like there were 300 different questions. There were 300 people asking the same three questions, which made it a lot easier.
Right. I have one question. I have one question, Anthony, that I got ahead of time, so I'm just going to put it in the chat box.
Sure, that's fine. Since we have a small class, when I open up for Q&As, we can all just log in and speak it. We don't have to worry about putting in chat boxes.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, it turns out, it's difficult because sometimes the question presented, I don't understand exactly where they're coming from. So it's easier just to do it verbally since we have a small crew.
Right. Great question. It's a good question.
Hi, Lynn, Frida. It's good to see your face finally.
So that question is actually answered on one of my slides.
Good.
So we don't have to worry about it.
Thank you.
Anthony, it's 10:01. Do we want to get started?
Whenever you want to start, it's up to you. If you think everybody's here, that's fine. If there's still people you want to let in, I can wait a couple minutes. It's not a big deal.
Mary, is anyone waiting to get in?
No, as they join, I'm letting them in immediately.
Yeah, Anthony's time is valuable. I'd like to get started.
Do you want me to just go with it or you want to do an introduction first?
No, go ahead. You can go straight
right.
to what you need to do. Thank you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Let me get this the right way here. Okay.
Anthony, I'd like to thank you for doing this, though. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, it actually makes my life easier because then all these people who wouldn't have been at the session don't have to call the hotline to clarify things. So, and it makes it easier for you too, because they're not calling you with questions, and brokers can get more educated, and licensees, they can educate their brokers. So it helps everybody all around.
Absolutely.
Okay, so welcome to the legal update. How did this? Okay, there we go. So after today's session, if you have any questions, you can call NYSAR's legal hotline Monday through Friday from 9 to 4 at 518-436-9727. So let's talk about complying with the NAR settlement. So as far as resources are concerned, we are asking NYSAR members to try to utilize your sources of information from your various realtor organizations, the National Association, the State Association, your local association, as well as your MLS. Those are the places you can find the most accurate information as it applies to the settlement. Please try not to go on the disinformation superhighway too much. We've gotten many calls in the hotline from individuals who have been watching YouTube videos or blogs or social media posts by people pertaining to the settlement, and a lot of that information is wrong. And it takes us twice as long to dispel the misinformation as it does for us to convey the correct information. So if you need information about the settlement, again, please try to rely upon those sources that are provided to you from your various realtor organizations. NYSAR has provided various resources for you, including the NYSAR statewide forms and the written guide to using the new NYSAR statewide forms. We did a video series, one video per form, to explain to you how to use the form. We also have a written guide on complying with the NAR settlement on NYSAR.com. And I sent a copy of this presentation to Mary, and she can provide it to all of you at the conclusion of the presentation today. So you will have this to refer back to, so don't feel like you have to take screenshots or anything.
Okay.
So we have two different lawsuits that are the main concerns as far as the NAR settlement is concerned. The first one was Sitzer Burnett. That was the one in Missouri where the jury made the decision back on October 31st that there's a $1.8 million judgment based on the liability because they found anti-competitive practices in the NAR requirement that cooperating compensation appear on the MLS. And that allegation essentially stated that by doing so, brokers were colluding with each other to make sure that each side got paid in every transaction. And that collusion, as a result of the requirement of listing cooperating compensation, was anti-competitive in nature. And as such, they found that there was liability on behalf of the National Association of Realtors for doing so. Now, in antitrust cases, that $1.8 billion could be tripled to $5.4 billion. So rather than risk the chance of losing on appeal, the National Association of Realtors made a determination that it would be in everyone's best interest to enter into a settlement agreement, which is what brings us here today. So many of you hear the August 17th date that's running around. That's the final date that NAR requires all MLSs to enter into the changes that are required as far as MLS policy is concerned. That date may be different depending upon your specific MLS that you subscribe to. These are all the different MLSs that have provided me the dates as far as their effective date is concerned. The only reason Cyborg is highlighted because they were the most recent one that I got. So that just shows that the addition to the list that I had going. So these are all of the implementation dates for all of the different MLSs. If you belong to more than one MLS, please take note that these are the dates that your MLS will begin enforcing the provisions of the settlement. So pursuant to the terms of the settlement, NAR has to do a number of things, and their associated boards have to do a number of things. The first one is that no offer of compensation can appear on the MLS. So on your implementation date for your MLS, all those compensation fields are going to disappear. They're not going to be there anymore. Furthermore, licensees are not permitted to indicate whether or not a compensation is being offered in the MLS, which means that you cannot utilize private remarks for doing so. So any reference to compensation at all will be removed from your MLS on the implementation date. However, offers of compensation can continue off MLS, which means that the brokers can convey to their cooperating brokers whether or not compensation is being offered, and that can be done in a number of different ways, and I'll explain that later. And last but not least, the settlement does permit seller concessions still, and we'll talk about concessions in a second. So NAR has an FAQ on facts.realtor, facts.realtor. It's a very comprehensive FAQ pertaining to the settlement. One of the things they discuss in the FAQs is the use of seller concessions. And the one thing that they emphasize is that seller concessions cannot be specifically earmarked for compensation to the buyer side or conditioned upon compensation to the buyer side. So essentially what that means is that listing agents should not be telling a seller that a seller concession is only to be used to pay the buyer's agent. Seller concessions can be used for any closing cost. Now, the reality of it is that if you offer a seller concession to the buyer and the buyer gets a seller concession, they can use that money towards any of the closing costs that it's applied to, which will then free up money for them that they can utilize to compensate the broker. So it's moving money from column A to column B essentially. So you don't have to sit there and say, well, offer seller concessions and that'll cover the commission. Seller concessions can cover anything. So don't specify that it's or earmark it specifically for commissions only. That is actually in the settlement itself. The second major change, which is going to apply to most of us and impact the industry the most, is the use of written agreements. Whenever a licensee is working with a buyer, they need to have a written buyer agreement for compensation. NYSAR has developed two different forms for this, an exclusive and non-exclusive agreement. But again, we'll talk to that into much greater detail in a little while. So again, on your MLS implementation date, you're going to see those policies go into effect. You're not going to have those compensation fields up there at all. And NAR let everybody know 3 months ahead of time that these changes were coming. So we've all had time to get ready for them. Although information trickled out a little bit after that, I think that we have the full picture of what the settlement's going to encompass now, so we can understand how it's going to work when that implementation date hits. So again, the MLS has policy changes, eliminate any offers of compensation, retain and define cooperation for MLS participants. Again, eliminate anyone making offers of compensation on the MLS in private remarks. The other thing too that, you know, I'll do this now, but members are entrepreneurial, right? Realtors are entrepreneurial by nature, at least in my opinion, they are. And I have already received phone calls from members trying to find a way around listing compensation on the MLS. So I had one member call me and say, well, listen, there's a bunch of fields in the MLS that nobody ever uses. Could a bunch of brokers get together and say, if we click on the field that hypothetically is for there's no utilities offered, could that be a way that we could tell each other we're offering compensation? And the answer to that is no. In no way, directly or indirectly, can you indicate on the MLS that compensation is being offered. All of the MLS execs have been advised of this after the person called me, because I don't want the MLSs getting in trouble either. So they will be looking to see if fields that have previously not been used are being used a lot more by the same brokers. So please don't try to do that in order to, I guess, get around the settlement. The other thing too is that it prohibits your MLS, your local, state, or national association from facilitating offers of compensation between brokers, which means that your local board or MLS or the state or national association can't create separate websites. They can't let you post compensation on their Facebook page, other social media tools. So they are entirely out of the compensation equation. The only thing that boards, associations, and MLSs can do is to create forms for you to utilize to comply with the settlement. So in no way will your MLS or local board in any way help to facilitate the dissemination of compensation between brokers. One of the other changes too has to do with the IDX feed. Since the MLS is prohibited from listing compensation, there are restrictions on the use of the IDX feed, which means that any broker or third party who gets an IDX feed and then uses that feed to populate a website or social media site to show compensation is also prohibited. So if the MLS finds out that someone who has access to an IDX feed is using it for the purposes of showing commissions from multiple brokers, they will have their IDX privileges revoked, and that will be shut down. The only exception to this is that brokers, you may use the IDX feed to populate your website with your own listings. And you can indicate whether or not compensation is being offered for your own listings only. You cannot utilize it to show the compensation of other brokers. So individual brokers and their associated licensees with websites, can use the IDX feed for properties listed only with their brokerage to show whether or not compensation is being offered. And again, the other issues we already talked about. So in the settlement, they use terminology that's not commonplace in New York State, and that's fine. I can take those terms and I can shift them over to something that we're all used to in New York State. But they use the term working with a buyer and touring a home, which triggers the need to use that written requirement. The agreement, or the settlement also, like I said, requires written agreements with buyers before you tour a home. NYSAR is going to shift that definition a little bit to apply to New York State, because again, we have terminology that all licensees are used to in New York. Rather than to create a new trigger, as I call it, where something has to be given to a consumer, we can use ones that are pre-existing. A home refers to residential property, 1 to 4 family units only. The settlement does not apply to rentals. It does not apply to commercial properties. It does not apply to vacant land. Now, just because the settlement doesn't apply to those other types of transactions, those compensation fields will still be removed from the MLS. So regardless of what type of transaction you have, residential, commercial, rentals, there will be no ability for you to use the compensation fields in the MLS once that implementation date goes into effect. So let's simplify working with and touring a home as used in the settlement. So we're recommending using triggers that currently exist in New York State law as far as delivery of documents are concerned. So in NYSAR's opinion, the use of a written agreement, the written compensation agreement, should occur immediately after the consumer signs the agency disclosure form. So you're going to have your interview with the buyer. You're going to talk about, this is what I can do for you. And then if the buyer seems interested, you start talking about compensation and what you expect as far as compensation is concerned. And once you agree on all those terms, then you would enter into the agency relationship, making you a buyer's agent, immediately followed by the signing of that written buyer agreement. This is the exact same thing that the law requires to be done with listing agreements. Within the real property law, it requires you to have the agency disclosure form signed first, immediately followed by the signing of the listing agreement. So we're using that law as a model for the written buyer agreements. This also benefits you as a licensee, because if you were to enter a buyer agency relationship using the agency disclosure form, and then you wait until right before you show a property to have them sign the written compensation agreement, they may say no. Right? You want to make sure as a licensee that you're going to get paid, because that compensation that you're used to that happened from the MLS is no longer there. It's no longer available to you. So in doing that, again, you're making sure that you're going to get paid, because you don't work for free. I don't think you want to work for free. I don't think that's a viable business model unless you are independently wealthy and want to help people buy homes. So by having that written agreement entered into when you first enter the agency relationship, you're going to know whether or not you're going to be compensated in the event that that purchaser or that buyer purchases a home through you.
We have a question in the chat box, Anthony.
Hold on. Whoops. Does that mean for the website, I can manually put on my office featured listings how much compensation is being offered? Yes, brokers and any associated licensee or team with that broker can list the compensation for those properties that are specifically listed with that brokerage. Okay, where was I? Okay, next slide. So again, it's only required when you represent the buyer. If you're a seller's agent, sub-agent, or broker's agent for the seller, you do not need to have a written agreement with the buyer. It only applies if you're representing the buyer. So if you're representing the seller, you do not need that written agreement with the buyer. Same thing applies if someone comes into your open house. You're there working as the seller's agent in the best interest of the seller. and you do not need to provide with them with the written buyer agreement because you are not representing that buyer. Dual agents and designated agents, you will need it because you had that buyer agency relationship already before entering into dual or designated. You're already a buyer's agent, so you would have already had that agreement in place. So it would be applicable in dual and designated agency as well. I only include the third bullet point because it's in the settlement, but if you are a non-agent or a transactional broker, you also need to have the written agreement with the buyer. NYSAR does not recommend utilizing non-agency relationship or transactional brokerages. The reason why is quite a few years ago, we requested an opinion from the Department of State as to the legality of non-agency relationships. The Department of State replied with a one-page opinion. I don't know, the opinions should usually be more than one page, but a one-page opinion it was given to us by the Department of State saying, yes, in fact, you can have non-agency relationships, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. And if you read between the lines, you could tell that the Department of State was against the use of these types of relationships in New York. So as a result of that, rather than subject members to scrutiny from the Department of State, NYSAR is recommending not to enter into those types of relationships. But again, I just mentioned it because it's part of the settlement agreement. So the written agreement has to include certain provisions. The first is a specific and conspicuous disclosure of the amount of the rate of compensation. And that's going to be provided either by a percentage of the selling price or a flat fee. And that amount has to be objectively ascertainable and not open-ended, which means that you have to use exact numbers. You can't say up to or as much as the seller's offering. It has to be definitive numbers so that when the buyer views the agreement, they understand exactly how much they're going to be responsible to pay that buyer's agent in the event they purchase a property under that agreement. Furthermore, the amount you put on that written buyer agreement, you cannot collect any more than that, which means that hypothetically, if you have a buyer agreement that calls for you to get a 5% compensation and the seller is offering 7, you can only collect 5. You can't collect any more than what the buyer has authorized you to collect in that written agreement. But there is a workaround for that. I'll get to that in the next slide. Last but not least, a conspicuous statement that broker fees and commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. So I mentioned about the compensation where you have an agreement for 5 and the seller is offering 7. You can you can modify the agreement with the buyer, either up or down, right, for more or less commission, as long as the two parties agree, right? Any contract can be modified if the parties of the contract agree to such modifications. However, if you are attempting to modify the agreement to collect more of a commission, since you are the agent of that buyer and owe them fiduciary duties, you also owe them the duty of informed consent as far as what they are consenting to if you're asking for more compensation. So you have to have a conversation with the buyer and you have to give them 4 options. Okay. Option 1 is that you, as the licensee, can collect the additional compensation. Option 2, the licensee and the buyer can split the additional compensation. 3, the buyer can choose to have that compensation given to them as a rebate. Or 4, the buyer can say, no, I don't agree to any additional compensation. You're going to take the 5 and that's it. So you have to have those conversations with the buyer. So the next question I always get is, well, Anthony, how do I convince the buyer that the extra compensation should just come to me? And it's a case-by-case basis, right? I mean, how long have you been working with them for? How many properties have you shown? How many hours have you worked? How many miles have you driven? This is what NAR and NYSAR and your local boards have been promoting to you for a while. What is the value of your service, right? What have you done for them? Why is it that you should receive more compensation than you agree to with them? And it's all going to be you trying to sell yourself to that buyer to convince them that you're entitled to the extra compensation. But again, they can choose to say, yes, you do deserve it. You've been working hard. You showed us, 73 homes, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can, they can choose to split it. You get 1% extra, they get 1% extra as a rebate. They can say, well, no, we don't think you should get any more. We want it all. Or the buyer says, no, there's no extra compensation at all. But regardless of what is said, both parties have to agree to it. Okay, so you can modify that agreement in the event that different compensation is offered. And like I said, it doesn't just have to be a modification to increase the amount of compensation. It could be an agreement to decrease the amount of compensation as well. So keep that in mind. So again, I want to stress the use of the written agreement. It's going to be part of your MLS policies. You have to use a written agreement if you're working with a buyer. If you fail to use a written agreement, you will be in violation of MLS policy. Now, the MLS is going to be the entity that is charged with enforcing violations of the policy, and the MLS will do so through a number of different ways. One way they can do it is obviously when receiving complaints from members. Hey, listen, I just had a buyer come to me and they were with ABC Realty, and they said ABC Realty told them, you don't have to fill out a form. We don't care. If other members are doing that, they're obviously putting you at a disadvantage. So it'd be in your best interest to report those individuals who are not complying with the settlement. There are no exceptions for members if they refuse to sign the written agreement. So if the buyer tells you, I'm not signing this agreement, I disagree, I'm not going to do it, you cannot work with them. So again, the use of the written agreement is extremely important. And please make sure that you have all of your buyers sign that. Now, discipline from your MLS can occur in a number of different ways. There is progressive discipline that the MLS is allowed to impose upon their members after a due process hearing. It can be anything from a slap on the wrist to expulsion from the MLS. So the sanctions that can be brought against you could be severe. There was a rumor going around previously that if you were found to be violating the policy, you're automatically terminated. That's not true. If you heard that, just forget about it. That's not actually going to happen. But it depends on how egregious the activities of the licensee are. If it's their first offense, it's one written agreement they haven't done. I can't see expulsion being an option. It would be probably a letter or some type of education they have to do, something along those lines. But if you are a frequent flyer or repeat offender of not providing written agreements, the MLS can decide at some point that, listen, this person's just not following our rules. We're going to expel them. And then you'd be expelled from the MLS. Brokers may be liable as well if they're permitting their licensees to work with buyers without agreements. That liability can extend to the broker as well. So what I'm recommending to brokers at this point is to, when your implementation date occurs, and you guys are August 8th, is that correct? For your ML? No, yes.
That's correct, Anthony.
August
Yes.
8th. Okay. So August 8th will be your drop dead date for compliance. So just make sure that that is being done on August 8th. Brokers, what you should do maybe for the first few weeks or so is to ask all your licensees to provide you with those written agreements to make sure they're using them and they're using them properly, right? This is all part of the educational process, brokers. And again, you want to cover yourself too. So maybe for the first few weeks or so, ask to see all of your licensees' written agreements with buyers to make sure they are in compliance. It really, it probably the biggest help you're going to get is being a broker.
Anthony,
Yes.
we don't own our own MLS. We're part of One Key. So would we still be requiring that of the brokers?
Well, your MLS would, right? Your MLS would be asked. Yeah. So it's your MLS. So yeah, I know there's a lot of boards that use One Key. So it's put what the Hudson Valley up to Dutchess now, I think. One Key reaches all the way up to Dutchess. So yeah, so One Key will be doing this, or they may not be doing this. It's up to them how they decide how they're going to proceed. But again, that the MLS can also require random audits. So they could ask you to please provide written buyer agreement like they do or have done with listing agreements in the past, but that's up to the MLS how they want to do that in addition to receiving complaints. Nancy, your question's on a slide that I'm going to get to eventually. Okay, again, I want to reiterate this. If you're working on behalf of a buyer, you need a written agreement. Failure to have one will subject you to debt discipline. And again, there are no exceptions or exemptions. There's no if, ands, or buts, or what ifs. If you have a written agreement, you're in compliance. If you don't, you're not in compliance. There are no exceptions. Speaking about offering compensation, brokers, you can offer compensation on your website. Again, only for your listings. And when I say website, I mean the broker's website or the website of any associated licensee or team with that brokerage. And you can show what compensation is being offered for your listings and your listings only. You can't list compensation offered by other brokers. You can't provide links to other brokers' pages where compensation is being offered. You can only, again, directly list your compensation for your listings on your website or social media site. Again, realtor associations are prohibited from creating their own site for their members to use. And you should not be utilizing other means to the MLS to show that cooperating compensation is being offered. And this is, like I mentioned, that one field that I was talking about, the one broker trying to get around it. The other thing, too, is if your MLS has you use a showing service, you cannot list the compensation in the showing service either. So NYSAR has created 5 forms. Well, we've amended 2 forms and created 3 new forms to comply with the settlement. The second part of today's presentation will be reviewing the NYSAR forms, showing how we implemented the changes into the forms, just to show you the language, not necessarily that you have to use the NYSAR forms, just how we put the policies into practice, so to speak. So we amended the exclusive buyer agency compensation agreement is amended. It was formerly known as the exclusive right to represent, also known as the exclusive buyer broker agreement. We changed the name of it because compensation is a more easy to use term because it refers to commissions or fees or any bonuses provided for a transaction. That's all deemed to be compensation. So we're using the term compensation in and throughout. So we amended the exclusive. We created a new form, which is the non-exclusive buyer agency compensation agreement, which is a lot like the exclusive, except it doesn't apply to anything the buyer buys or purchases. It only applies to properties that are located or shown by the buyer's agent to the buyer. And then those properties are covered under the non-exclusive agreement. We amended our exclusive right to sell. And then we created 2 new forms so that buyer's agents can have a contract with the party offering compensation. So again, like I said before, there's nothing prohibiting sellers from offering compensation. They can do so, and they can offer cooperating compensation directly from the seller or through the listing broker. So we created a form to facilitate each of those different types of compensation being offered. The first one, obviously, is with the listing broker, where the listing broker and cooperating broker are going to sign a contract saying that the listing broker is offering the cooperating broker compensation of 5%, and that's signed, so it's enforceable. And the same thing with the seller. It'll be the seller and the buyer's agent entering to this agreement where the seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent or buyer's broker a certain amount of compensation. Now, I have to warn you ahead of time that even though the seller may be offering compensation or can compensate the buyer's agent is prohibited from contacting the seller directly. Any communications concerning compensation with the seller must be done through the listing broker. So those rules of being able to contact the principal of another licensee or another brokerage is still in effect. So you can't contact the seller directly. It has to go through the listing broker. Now, today, since August 8th is right around the corner, you should really be implementing all of these changes now. You have to have discussed compensation during your buyer agent interview. How much do you expect? Different ways that you can be compensated, et cetera, right? You want full informed consent of that buyer. And again, like I said, you should have that compensation agreed to before entering to the buyer agency relationship. And you should have really been having these discussions all along. For instance, if there was a FISBO, you should have been discussing with the buyer at the onset that, well, if you want to buy a for sale by owner, understand the seller may not be paying me and you have to pay me. So you really should have been having these conversations already. But if you haven't, you need to start doing it now. Brokers, another thing you can do to help educate your licensees and to help minimize your potential for liability is maybe provide your licensees with bullet points about what they now have to discuss because of the settlement. Listen, like me doing this presentation, I think this is number 7 or 8 for me so far. It's becoming second nature, right? I have my spiel down. I have what I'm going to say to you and my side comments. They're all second nature now. Same thing with you. When you go to listing appointments, you have your particular script that you follow. Well, now you're going to have a script, an amended script now to apply to buyers. And you just have to remember what you have to say, what you can say, what you can't say. So maybe having a cheat sheet or bullet points provided by your broker instructing licensees on what they should be discussing so they make sure they hit all the points they're supposed to hit will probably be advantageous to the brokerage at this point in time. So brokers, you may want to consider, based on your office policy, how you want buyers, agents to interact with potential buyers. And that would, again, alleviate any potential for liability somewhere down the road. So currently, there are available exclusive and non-exclusive buyer agency representation agreements for compensation. Again, NYSAR has developed 2 of them. I know many local boards or MLSs are also producing their own. You have an option which ones you want to use. You don't have to use NYSAR's. You don't have to use the one provided by your local board or your MLS. You can produce your own, just so long as they are in full compliance with the settlement and other requirements as far as language in certain agreements. If you wanted to use your own, make sure you have your attorney review them. NYSAR nor the local board will review your form to make sure it's in compliance. So if you want to use your own forms, you need to have your own attorney review them to make sure that they're in compliance with the settlement and other New York State laws or regulations. Brokers need to review their SOPs if they're going to mandate exclusive buyer agreements. As you know, as a result of the Long Island Divided investigation from Newsday, one of the laws that were passed required brokers to publish their standard operating procedures, and whether they require buyers to show identification, whether they require buyers to have a pre-qual, or whether they require buyers to enter to an exclusive buyer compensation agreement. So you don't necessarily have to change your SOP because of the settlement. The only time you have to indicate on your SOP is if you're going to require all of your licensees to use that exclusive buyer compensation agreement. Brokers, if you're not requiring them to use an exclusive and they can use a non-exclusive, you just indicate that this broker does not require the use of exclusive agreements. You don't have to indicate the fact that you require non-exclusives. That's not covered under the law. The law only refers to the use of exclusive agreements. So keep that in mind. And again, you should educate your licensees as to the different ways in which buyer agents can collect commissions, which is the next slide. So how can buyer's agents get compensated? Well, they can get compensated by the seller, and they can get, like I said, compensated by the seller directly, where the seller says, I'm going to offer X% to buyer's agents, and that comes out of the seller's proceeds directly to the buyer's agent. The seller can authorize the listing broker to offer cooperating compensation, much like is done now. Right? The listing broker is offering cooperating compensation to cooperating brokers. The seller can authorize the listing broker to continue to do so, although off the MLS, obviously. Or the buyer's agent can include as part of the offer a request for compensation from the seller in the event that the seller is not offering compensation or the amount of compensation they're offering is not enough based on the agreement that the buyer's agent has with the buyer. The buyer has to authorize the buyer's broker to request compensation from the seller or listing agent. NYSAR's forms include that. It's not an option. It's automatic. It states that the buyer gives the broker permission to seek compensation from the listing agent or the seller first. So we included that automatically in our buyer compensation agreement. The buyer can also agree to compensate the buyer's agents themselves. So you can collect from the seller, or you can collect from the buyer, or you can collect from both. So you can collect from more than one party as long as your client consents to it. And again, that consent is built into the NYSAR exclusive buyer compensation agreement. If the buyer refuses to compensate you as part of the written agreement, you don't have to work with them. So if you're talking to them about the agreement and they say, well, that's fine, but I only want you to get compensated from the seller, you can say, well, I can't guarantee the seller is going to offer compensation directly or through the listing broker. So I need some guarantee that if that's not happening, that you will in fact compensate me. And if the buyer says no, you don't have to work with them. It's up to you if you want to take that risk. But just be warned that you could go and have a transaction where the seller and listing broker are not offering compensation and refuse to offer compensation, even if you request it as part of the purchase offer, and you will be left high and dry with no compensation at all. So again, make sure you are being compensated. Cooperating compensation. So many individuals believe that cooperating compensation is offered to any licensee. It is not. What we deem to be cooperating compensation is only offered from one broker to another broker. Cooperating compensation is not being offered to licensees for an in-house transaction, for instance, dual or designated. So whereas brokers may have, under the current policy where cooperation is required on the MLS, may have given other licensees in their office the same split that was offered to perhaps buyer's agents in the event that it's dual or designated. Those offers of cooperating compensation are not to be utilized for in-house transactions in the future after the settlement. And I'll explain why when I get to the forms. There are some intersections between the settlement and New York state law, one of which was the SOP, which I just talked about a few minutes ago. The second is the New York Code Rules and Regulations, section 175.7. Under this regulation, it requires any licensee or broker who's receiving compensation from more than one party to get the full knowledge and consent of your client before you can do so. Now, again, NYSAR's built this permission already into its buyer compensation agreement. But if you're using other agreements, make sure that it gives you permission to collect compensation from more than one party. For instance, from the seller and from the buyer. But again, NYSAR worked it into our forms. Make sure if you use other forms, that includes that provision to give you that permission. So what happens to agreements that are in place prior to the implementation date for you, August 8th? If you have agreements in place prior to August 8th, you will need to have compliant forms in place by August 8th. So your current listing agreement or your current buyer representation agreement or buyer compensation agreement, if they are not in compliance with settlement, you'll need to have new ones filled out prior to your implementation date. So you need them done prior to 11/59/59 on August 7th. NYSAR has not provided addendums to utilize. We're recommending you use the new forms in their entirety, merely because we tried to make an addendum and it was extremely complicated because we move paragraphs around and read numbered things. And for it to be an effective addendum, it would have to be like, paragraph 4 is now paragraph 6. Paragraph 5 has been modified in part here. It would be much too complicated to consumers. So we're recommending that, again, prior to implementation date, you have all your current buyers and sellers sign the new form so you are in compliance. What about current offers of compensation on the MLS? Well, as we sit here today, your MLS may still have compensation fields, and there may still be listings up there where there's cooperating compensation being offered to other brokers. Those offers of compensation go away on your implementation date, okay? And you cannot rely upon them once those fields are gone off your MLS because those listing agents will now have new or amended listing agreements with their sellers that are in compliance with the settlement, which includes no longer requiring offers of compensation. The only way you can rely upon those offers of compensation is if you have a binding contract of sale in place prior to your implementation date. So you have a contract that's signed by the buyer and the seller prior to the implementation date, then that cooperating broker can rely upon that compensation that was on the MLS. But again, you need to have that binding contract of sale in place prior to the implementation date. If not, you have to use all the new forms. So brokers, we'll talk a little bit more about the SOP law. I kind of touched on it before. I'll just go over this quickly with you. Again, you're required to put the SOP on your website as well as the website of all your associated licensees, because their websites are considered the website of the broker pursuant to New York State law. So again, unless you're going to require exclusives of all your buyers, you don't need to indicate the use of non-exclusives on your SOP. Now, nothing prevents you from doing so if you want to. If you want to list there that ABC Realty requires all buyers to sign, non-exclusive compensation agreements, you can do that, but it's not required under law. And just as a reminder that whatever the broker's policy is applies to every licensee in the office. So brokers, if your SOP is that we do not require exclusive buyer compensation agreements, then nobody in your office can require exclusive compensation agreements. The SOP applies to every licensee in the office. So you can't have a licensee telling a buyer, well, I'm not going to work with you unless you sign exclusive, if your SOP states that you do not require exclusive. So all of your licensees have to comply with the SOP. They cannot have their own SOP as a licensee or as a team. So we're going to talk a little bit about dual or designated agency. This is the, well, actually, hold on a sec. So I stopped sharing, right? I'm back on. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about what I presented already before we go into dual or designated? Because this seems to be something where I have a lot of questions about dual. So any questions about what I covered so far? And if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself.
Anthony,
Yep.
so the MLS is probably going to institute these new forms, or NYSAR has these new forms. So when these new forms are prepared, one must prepare the new forms, present them to the seller with the current explanation of compensation and how it will occur. At that point, is the original agreement with the seller valid, or is this going to have to be a brand new agreement with a brand new negotiation?
So what I'm recommending you do is just you take whatever the terms of that agreement you have now and just transfer them to the new one. So let's say your expiration date is August 31st. The new one would just be the same terms expiring August 31st. If you want to try to renegotiate a new listing agreement with them, you can do that. But again, you would just be transferring whatever the current terms are to the new forms. Oh, but if you have an addendum, obviously the terms would stay, but I don't know what MLSs or boards are creating addendums. So
Second question I have is, I put in the chat, is these new forms will have to be resubmitted to the MLS, correct?
whatever your MLS requires.
Okay, thank
Each
you.
MLS is different. I believe One Key was discussing no longer requiring documents to be submitted, but I'm not sure exactly where Patrick, sorry, where Richard and One Key have ended up with that.
Thank you.
Yep, but they will be communicating with you. Richard's on top of everything. You have a really great MLS with a great executive there. So I cannot say enough positive things about Richard Haggerty. Any other questions before I go into the dual and designated scenarios?
Yeah,
None? Oh,
just,
go ahead.
buyer concessions, seller concessions work just the same way as they've always done, right?
Yeah, there's really no
Or-
change.
Where that amount has to now be covered in the appraisal, whether the money goes to the brokers or not.
Yeah, there's nothing different about it today than there will be after the settlement's done.
Okay.
Yeah,
The
and
other-
you're gonna see going forward, not that much has really changed. A few things have changed, but the underlying principles are all the same.
Right. You mentioned that brokers can have a list on their website or whatever they choose to have. to show compensation offered. Many of us have IDX websites who pull from MLS. Is that a problem?
Again, you would only be able to use the IDX feed for listing compensation for your listings only.
Correct. Okay, good.
Okay.
Anthony, if I may,
Yep.
we're saying that the buyer agreements will remain the same, but in the discussion, you had mentioned that the buyer can have various options about where the compensation is going to come from. So that would not have been typical of the past form. For example, the buyer can say you can accept a higher or lower, that the money will be split, etc. So how is that similar to the past form where compensation would be expected from the seller's offering and or from the buyer directly?
So it really doesn't differ that much because the provisions that are in the current buyer agreement also replicated in the revised buyer agreement, but for those changes we had to put in because of the settlement. So we didn't really rewrite the forms per se. We just replaced or added sections to comply with the settlement, but much of the language is the same as it stands today prior to the settlement, right? With just a couple little twists in it. Okay. Anybody else before I share my screen again?
Anthony,
Oh,
I have
Carol.
a question. Oh, go ahead, Carol.
Good.
You
No,
first.
someone.
So I know addendums to the listing agreement, they're not recommended, but can we do our own so that we have an addendum to our current listing agreements?
So long as you know that addendum's in full compliance with the settlement, sure.
Well, there's mostly, I mean, my understanding is mostly just certain language that has to be in there, right? So
Yeah, but like I said, when I got into redoing NYSAR's, when I thought it was going to be a simple change, and it was anything but simple, and mostly just because of rearranging things and taking a sentence out here and inserting a sentence there. So, you can try one. You just have to see how complex it's going to end up.
would legal help like review that for us? It has to only be our own lawyer, right?
We do not review any forms from members.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So Anthony, I have a question, and you're probably going to go over this when you go over the exclusive right to sell and the forms side of things, but just let me know. On where it says the seller's offering compensation to cooperating brokers. I've been on a lot of webinars and they're saying the second part of that where it says seller is authorizing listing broker to offer cooperating compensation to cooperating broker. Does that mean that I, as a broker, would pay the other broker, and if I don't get paid, I would still be required to pay that to the cooperating broker, correct?
Same as it is now, right?
Oh.
Same as it is now.
Okay.
But then, if you go to arbitration, we're jumping ahead of ourselves, but I don't want to just leave this sitting out there dangling until I cover it. If you go to arbitration now and you offered compensation to a buyer's agent and you never got paid by the seller, that's something you can bring up in arbitration that, hey, listen, I never got compensated yet. So how can I be expected to compensate the other side? All those rules will still apply.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else? Elise.
Hold on. I have a question. Is NYSAR or anybody going to advertise to this public that these changes have come into effect where the buyers, I take a lot of buyers out and a lot of them are going to go, well, I'm not paying.
So
And they're not
NYSAR,
aware of changing the law.
yeah, in the next couple weeks, NYSAR is doing a statewide push. We have taken out full page advertisements in major newspapers with a letter from our
Hooray.
president, Joe Rivellino, explaining the settlement and how the settlement works and how it's going to impact buyers. So we are working on that, and they will be out in most major newspapers within the next few weeks.
Thank you.
Teresa? Teresa with your hand up? No, Teresa, if you're trying to talk, you're muted. No, Teresa, who's on a phone with their hand up? All right, Teresa, I'm going to lower your hand. If you still have a question afterwards, let me know. Okay, let's go to dual agency. Share again. Okay, you should back up to where it says dual designated. I lost the other part of my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, here we go. So dual and designated is impacted by this, and it's impacted in a number of different ways. But what has come to light recently is the manner in which licensees in New York State were practicing dual agency. And in some instances, they were practicing it the wrong way. So I want to reiterate how dual agency is supposed to occur in New York State. So the Department of State, a long time ago, issued a legal opinion or legal memorandum, they call it, and it's memorandum LI 12. LI does not refer to Long Island, just to let you know ahead of time. It's the way in which they categorize their specific opinions. So LI 12 had to do with licensure, LI. And they talk about dual agency. And this memorandum is titled Be Wary of Dual Agency. And this is a consumer document, but it's a legal memorandum that the Department of State put out regardless that is still effective today. When explaining dual agency, the Department of State makes it very clear that the buyer-agency relationship must exist prior to the buyer showing interest in a property that's listed with your brokerage in order for dual agency to occur. So you would need to have a buyer-agency disclosure form signed with the buyer prior to the buyer saying, oh, I'm interested in your property at 123 Main Street. Now, we'll go on a little bit further in the memo, and they talk about your fiduciary duties, including undivided loyalty and full and fair disclosure. For those of you who may have utilized NYSAR's forms, NYSAR created two forms called the Advanced Informed Consent to Dual Agency and the Advanced Informed Consent to Designated Agency. In those forms, it also makes it very clear that that buyer-agency relationship must have been in existence prior to the buyer showing interest in the property. And that's contained in both the dual agency form and the designated agency informed consent form. So many of you are scratching and saying, Anthony, why are you bringing this up now? Why are you talking to us about this? And I'll tell you exactly why. Unbeknownst to me, many NYSAR members have been practicing dual agency incorrectly. And what they were doing essentially is you're the listing agent, you're hosting an open house, a buyer comes in to view the property who's unrepresented, and the listing agent takes that opportunity to sign the buyer up as a buyer's agent. That is not the correct way to do buyer agency in New York, because that relationship didn't exist prior to the buyer showing interest in the property, which is walking through the front door. When you're at an open house, you're representing the seller in the seller's best interest, and you have your fiduciary duty to the seller, including undivided loyalty. Your purpose of hosting that open house is not to give you the opportunity to sign up that buyer so that you can get both sides of the transaction. That's acting against your seller's best interest. So I didn't realize that licensees were in fact doing this on a regular basis. And that is the improper way of doing dual agency. So in that scenario, if you're hosting an open house and an unrepresented buyer comes in and says, I'm interested in the property, you have to say, well, listen, I'm representing the seller. You can be a customer. You can provide CMAs to that buyer, but you cannot be a buyer's agent. You cannot be a dual. You cannot be a designated. You can tell that buyer if they want representation, they have to go to another brokerage if they want to have a buyer's agent represent them and their best interest. Now, this also applies if you have a listing at 123 Main Street and the buyer contacts you and says, hey, I want to view your property. You say, are you represented? They say, no. You can't say, well, I can represent you for this, because you can't, because now you're still acting in the seller's best interest. They're contacting you because you're the listing agent. And again, you cannot use that as an opportunity to sign that buyer up. Now, you also can't refer them to anybody else in your office, because of the fact that everyone in your office is technically an agent of that seller. Your broker, the seller, is their client. Your broker owes them fiduciary duties. By virtue of the broker being the seller's agent, so are all licensees in that office. Again, unless you had a buyer agency agreement that existed prior to the buyer showing interest in that property. So again, that's how dual agency should be done. That buyer agency relationship must exist prior to the buying show interest in the property in order to effectively do dual or designated. Now, nothing prohibits you. So let's say you're doing that open house again. The buyer walks in to see it. You tell them you're the seller's agent. Buyer looks at it and says, you know what, this isn't really what I wanted. I really wanted something that has, you know, a great room. I wanted something with a pool. You know, do you have any other properties like that? You can sign the buyer up as a buyer's agent then for those other properties, but not for the property that they're currently viewing at the open house or the property they called you up to view. That you happen to have listed. So you can sign them as a buyer's agent for other properties, but not for that property where you had the initial contact with the buyer. And again, just reiterate the fact, the buyer agency must have been entered into prior to the buyer showing interest in the property listed by the brokerage, etc. So I am going to stop my share for a minute to see if anyone has any questions about that dual agency scenarios or those dual agency scenarios. And this has always been the case. This isn't anything new. I just didn't realize how many licensees were actually doing it improperly. So does anybody have any questions? Rosemary or
Yeah.
Rosemary? Is it
I mean,
Rosemary or Rosemary? I don't want to screw it up.
Rosemary, yeah.
Okay.
That's really a very sad state of affairs, because certainly for 30 years of doing continuing education and teachers teaching us dual agency, what you now say is totally new. Totally new. You know, we're little brokers, and of course we have listings and we get calls. What am I supposed to do? How do I change my practice from the last 30 years of doing dual agency?
They have to be a customer. They can't be a client. I mean, how is using your representation of a seller to try to get a buyer in the seller's best interest? It's not.
But the seller on the form also agrees, right? He signs the advance consent to dual agency.
Which states that the relationship needed to exist prior to them showing interest in the property. That doesn't say they're giving you permission to utilize an open house for the purposes of getting a buyer's agency relationship with that buyer to the detriment of the seller.
No. We're not even, you're Sullivan County. We don't talk open house. Just by buyers contacting a listing broker. So, I mean, this really changes everything. I don't know if anybody else agrees, but I'm sure they do. I mean, that's just
so not an open house, right? So you have a buyer call you up for a house you currently have listed. They say they want to view the property.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't use that to say, well, I can sign you up to be my buyer for this property because you're already the seller's agent. How can you be the buyer's agent and the seller's agent for a property simultaneously?
Easy.
You can't.
You can.
Right
Well,
off
you
the bat,
can't.
say I'd love to take you out. FYI, I'm the listing agent, as you know, so I would be a dual agent under this scenario. And if you'd like me to recommend another agent from my team, if you're more comfortable with that, I'm happy for that to happen. But
Can't do it. Period.
well, I mean, that eliminates a lot, frankly, a lot of our business.
Yeah,
That eliminates all our business.
Exactly. It's
Ridiculous.
terrible.
I've
Terrible.
never heard before that the buyer had to be interested
Me
in
either.
another property and be signed up as a buyer's agent first, sorry, as a buyer with you prior to them then converting to accepting you as a dual agent. I've never heard that before.
Me
No.
either. Then why have dual
But
agent?
how can you
This
how can
makes
you
no
be a
sense.
dual agent? How can you be a dual agent if you weren't representing the buyer as a buyer's agent first?
Then why have dual
I don't
agency?
know. I've been doing it for years. It's worked out
Well,
fine.
because listen, you
Yes,
may
me
have
too.
buyers who already have an agreement to be a buyer's agent with someone in your firm or yourself, and then they show interest in a property you have listed.
Mm-mm.
But people go to the listing agent often because they are, sorry, buyers go to the
100%.
listing agent often because they are the ones doing the marketing. They're
Right.
generating the interest in the property because they know the property the best. They've been out there marketing it. The buyer says, I want to use you. You know what everything
And your
about this
answer is
house.
no, I
Tell me
cannot
about it.
and your answer is no, I cannot represent you.
Honestly,
I cannot,
this is
I
worse.
cannot
Then you've
breach my
eliminated dual
fiduciary.
agency from our experience.
You eliminated our business. This is horrible.
I didn't eliminate anything. This has been
Yeah.
the fact for the past few decades.
But it's only coming up now. I mean,
I've
what a
never
whammy
heard
that
that.
was.
I've never heard
I
that.
didn't listen. That's yeah. I mean, the NYSAR form states it. The DOS opinion states it. This is nothing new.
Makes no sense.
It makes all the sense in the world.
Not really. Why have
Sure.
dual
How
agency
can
then?
you breach your fiduciary duties to the seller by saying
You're not
I'm going to
breaching
represent you,
anything. You're
buyer?
being open and honest.
No, you're not being open and honest. You may not like it, but this is the facts.
By telling.
This just makes no sense because if you're, if you're working with a customer and
You're a
You're dual
customer.
they're
agent. What's
interested in your
breaching about it?
property,
Dual agency anymore. I don't even
or your
understand it.
office
None.
property,
Listen, I
then,
need one
I
person to
always tell
speak at a
them,
time.
okay, I always tell them that they're going to, if I'm showing a property that is listed by my office, then I would be in a dual agency agreement and I would have to be open and honest about everything to both sides and also respect your confidentiality. That's the
How is
way
that
it's
acting?
always been
How is that
represented
acting
to
in the,
me.
but again, you need to answer, how is that acting in the seller's best interest?
Well, if the seller would agree that I could be a dual agent and then I could show their house and represent both sides, then what would be the problem?
Because the consent the seller gave you was to enter into a dual agency relationship where that buyer agreement already was in place, such as what the NYSAR Advance Informed Consent to Dual Agency form has always stated. That relationship is in place prior to.
That just makes no sense. How are you're going to lose customers? There's no way to do that.
Listen, this is
without saying,
so
okay,
here's what the issue is. You're putting your interest above that of your client who is the seller so that you can get both sides of the deal. That is self-interest. That's self-dealing. That's putting your interest above that of your client who is the seller.
but my client that is the seller has already agreed with me that if I show your house and I'm bringing a customer to you, that I would be working in a
That is
dual
not what the
agency
seller,
way.
that is not what the seller agreed to. The seller agreed to let you practice dual agency in the event you have a buyer agency relationship in place with that buyer already. Period.
So then what? If I get a buyer into my office, I should say, maybe I should show you another house that's not from our office first. I enter into a buyer agency agreement and then I can show you the house that's from my office. That's ridiculous.
No, you show them the property listed with your office as the seller's agent and they're a customer.
Makes no sense to me.
So they remain unrepresented. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, listen, they're still a customer. You can still provide them with CMAs, right? Appropriate CMAs so they know how much they should offer on the property, but you can't represent them for that property.
I guess we can get used to that.
Yes, like I said, this is one of the more popular topics I've been covering. So, which is why I did a separate Q&A for it specifically. James?
I think what I'm hearing is that when a buyer comes into the office, they're coming to see a listing of your office. So they're a customer. And then once you show them any in-house listing, then there is no relationship with them because you cannot show them a property with only a buyer's broker's compensation is offered. So that's it. That once you've shown them the in-house listings, that customer cannot be cannot work with you on any other listings other than in-house because you're representing the seller.
No. So let's go through the scenario, right? I call you because you have a listing at 123 Main Street. I say, James, I'm interested in seeing 123 Main Street. You tell me, okay, that's fine. Listen, I'm the agent of the seller. I'm the listing broker. I act in the seller's best interest. If you want to look at other properties other than this, I can represent you as the buyer's agent, but for this particular property, I can't. So then you go through the showing and they say, I don't like this. I need, a pool. And then you can show them other properties as the buyer's agent. If one of the other properties you happen to identify is an in-house listing, you can then be a dual agent because you have that buyer agency representation in place prior to them showing interest in that other property you have listed. But that initial property, which you had the first substantive contact with the buyer, you can't be a buyer's agent for. That's all I'm saying. Because the only reason why licensees want to sign up that buyer is to get both sides of the transaction. And that's self-dealing. That's acting against your client's best interest, putting your interest financial above that of the seller. It's the only reason why people did it at that point. Is that Gene?
Yeah. So, oh, that's not good. Sorry, we had two computers going. If I meet, like I'm at an open house and I meet someone and I tell them I'm a seller's agent, I act on behalf of the seller and the seller's best interest, etc. And they basically what I am telling them is I'm happy to show you the house. You are entitled to have your own representation. A lot of times they don't want that. They just want to get an offer in. So if they're a customer and we are able to put an offer in, obviously I tell them I can't, they'll ask, what will they be willing to take and all those kind of questions. And I say, I'm sorry, I work on behalf of the seller. I cannot lead those conversations. Again, you're welcome to have your own representation. They still want to get an offer in. I can still put an offer in now with all these new policies in place. Like, how do you do that?
You just submit the offer.
So
right? You give them CMAs.
I still need to do the compensation? Obviously, I'm not going to.
No, because you're not working with the buyer. You're not a buyer's agent working in the buyer's best interest. You're an agent of that seller. So you do not need to have that written compensation agreement with the buyer.
Okay, so now I'm only getting paid from the seller.
And we'll cover that when we get to the forms.
Okay.
Okay. There's a workaround in the forms for that.
Okay.
I just lowered your hand for it.
Oh, thank you.
Anybody else?
Question. I do have a question. So this is not only the listing agent. So this is basically, I'm not allowed to refer them to anyone else in my brokerage as well, right?
Not as a buyer's agent, no.
Right. If the buyer calls me, I can't say, yeah, I'll talk to my colleague. I've got to refer them to an entirely different brokerage.
If they want their own representation of a buyer's agency, yes. And if you want to refer them to another broker, you can, and you can get a referral fee for that, so long as it's disclosed. So you can still get a referral fee for that referral to another brokerage for them to get represented. Anybody else?
Yes. I'm looking at the New York State disclosure form for buyer and seller, and nowhere in the form does it state what you just said.
Because the New York State disclosure form is not comprehensive. It requires you, which is why NYSAR did the advanced informed consent to dual and advanced informed consent to designated, because using the form does not and is not meeting your responsibilities of informed consent. You need to explain to consumers more than what's contained on the disclosure form. The disclosure form just memorializes that you had that conversation with the consumers, and then they execute that form. That form in and of itself does not satisfy your requirement to explain agency.
So I've taken many, many agency classes, and no instructor has ever said what you're saying now.
Yep.
I don't know why they didn't.
Never.
Yeah, I don't know.
And I agree, most of the buyers that call in lately want to work with the listing agent. They don't want to work with somebody that is not the listing agent. And that's their choice.
But it's not your choice.
No, it's not my choice, it's their choice.
Yeah, but they don't have the option to do it. You can't be a buyer's agent for, like I said, you can't do it.
So I guess the reason that they're wanting to work with the listing agent is because they know that they will not be responsible for any compensation, and the seller will be responsible for all the compensation.
What do you, I don't
Is
quite,
that true?
I don't quite follow. You mean after the
So
settle? You mean after the settlement?
Well, I've had a lot of people call up since the settlement's been discussed and say, I want to work with the listing agent. And therefore, I think they're thinking that they should, therefore, if I'm the listing agent and I can't be a dual agent, that all the compensation is still going to come from the seller and they won't have to pay any compensation. Maybe that's why they're asking for the listing agent each time.
Yeah, that's possible. I've seen that in some of the commentary other individuals have made as far as this the settlement's concerned. Yeah, I've seen that out there. Did someone have their hand up and put it down? No, I
Yeah.
thought I saw a hand up.
I do, Anthony. I have a question.
Sure.
This is Lynn Frieda. What I guess what a lot of people are saying is we used to have a lot of unrepresented buyers. All right. They would come in if we do a lot of listing, as everybody does on this call. And if they call to work with the listing agent because they think that we know it better and that kind of thing, then we would tell them, well, you are an unrepresented buyer. Are you all right with that? Because we represent the seller. And that would be okay with them if that's how they wanted to do it. They were unrepresented buyers. That's how I did it. I didn't really like to do dual agency, so I did it that way. Other people would do dual agency. Now, basically, the settlement is saying that the buyers all have to be represented. So that's the change for a lot of us. We've got
Well, I
to
mean,
sign
they
people
don't
up.
have to be represented, but if they are represented, you need to have a written compensation agreement with them.
So okay, because I thought a lot of the settlement meant that we're going to have all the buyers need to have representation. So you're saying that buyers do not have to have representation. We can.
Buyers never had to have representation. That's up to them. If they don't want representation, they don't have to have representation.
So if somebody wants to come and work with me and on a property that I'm listing or my office is listing, I can just work with them as an unrepresented buyer and therefore collect only the commission from the list, from the seller.
Correct.
And that's what they're looking for.
Possibly, yes. I don't know what's going through a buyer's mind.
But the seller, according to these forms, the seller does have the capacity when you get your listing to offer compensation to the cooperating broker. So if a buyer comes to me, Anthony, this is Myra Rappaport, and wants to see one of my listings, and I say, well, I can't represent you, you will be unrepresented, but I know that my seller has signed this form when I took the listing saying they will offer compensation to a cooperating broker. Does that mean that I can show it to the buyer unrepresented and still collect whatever that commission has been agreed on with my seller?
Because cooperating compensation is only offered to other brokers. It's not for the use of in-house. Right. And this is where many people have the issues that, currently when you have a listing agreement, the buyer or the seller agrees to pay the listing broker a certain percentage of that amount that they're paying. They authorize listing broker to take part of that to pay cooperating compensation. After the settlement, you're not going to have that combined compensation for the listing broker. The listing broker is going to get X, then there's going to be a separate section to pay cooperating brokers. So the listing agreement is only going to show what the listing side is getting. Does that make sense, Jennifer?
But the new listing agreement does provide for a changeable commission structure should there be dual agency.
Correct. And we'll get to that. The forms are next. The forms are the next part of the slideshow I'm going to be presenting. All right. So let's go to the forms. And then if you have questions about it, we can talk about it after that. Okay. So let's talk about the statewide forms. So NYSAR produced, again, 5 statewide forms. I'm not going to review them again because I talked about them at the beginning, but we're going to start with the exclusive buyer agency compensation agreement. So I mentioned before that all forms must have a disclosure pertaining to compensation being negotiable and not set by law. This is the disclosure NYSAR used. Compensation is not set by law or any realtor association or MLS, and that compensation to broker is fully negotiable between the buyer and the broker. We further went one step more and required an initial for that section so that the buyer can't say, I didn't know, because you say, yes, you did, because you initialed that you saw that section. So that's what NYSAR put in there for the compensation disclosure. Now let's talk about actual compensation. So again, not much has changed in the language of the buyer agreement other than for compliance purposes. The first part of the compensation agreement under the exclusive buyer compensation agreement is that if the buyer purchases a property during the term of this agreement, whether on their own or through the efforts of a broker, that they will owe a commission to that particular buyer's broker. The compensation section is very simple: flat fee or percentage of the purchase price, or in the event the buyer leases, a percent of the aggregate rental, or a flat fee if they decide to lease the property. I mentioned before, NYSAR built in the fact that the buyer gave you permission to seek compensation from the listing broker and seller first. This is that particular section of that agreement where they give you that permission. The next section states that in the event that the seller or listing broker do not offer compensation, or the amount of compensation being offered is less than the amount that the buyer agreed to, that the buyer will make the buyer broker whole, making sure they're compensated the amount that's been agreed to. So let's say the agreement's for 5%. You look for compensation from the seller. Seller says, we're not offering compensation. Listing broker's not offering compensation. That buyer owes you 5%. But let's say you contact the seller or listing broker. The listing broker and listing broker says, listen, we're offering compensation of 3%. Then the buyer would have to pay you the additional 2% to make you whole up to that 5%, the same as it is now. The last sentence is regarding dual and designated. In the event the buyer and seller agree to enter into dual or designated, the buyer is responsible for paying the compensation on the buy side of the transaction. And I'll explain that in the next slide. And last but not least, the last sentence is that the buyer's broker cannot collect any more compensation than what was agreed to. But again, you can still, I say to the buyer, have agreed to additional compensation in writing, so you can change that or amend that, like I mentioned before. So now let's talk about in-house sales, in-house transactions. If it is an in-house deal, the buyer and seller have to consent to dual or designated. If they don't do that, they have options. The buyer or seller can choose if they want to dissolve the relationship with the broker on the buy side or the sell side, because they do not have to agree to dual or designated. Secondly, is if there is dual or designated that's agreed to by both parties, that the buyer agrees that they have to compensate the buyer's broker in full. And the reason why is that, don't forget, in dual agency or designated agency, the broker is always a dual agent. As a dual agent, a broker is prohibited from acting in the detriment of either party. So again, the broker is both the listing side and the buyer side. So the broker cannot go back to their client as part of an offer and say, you're going to have to pay us more money pursuant to this offer, which is why the buyer would have to pay whatever the agreed upon compensation is in this agreement. Lastly, we have the dispute resolution section. The NYSAR Statewide Forms Committee made a determination that for any dispute arising from this agreement, that the only mechanism by which you can, the only method by which that the dispute can be rectified would be through the local realtor association, first through mediation, then arbitration. If the local board doesn't offer mediation, then it goes right to arbitration. Or if it is mediated and the parties don't come to a resolution, then it goes to arbitration. Section C of the dispute resolution section is a waiver, whereby the consumer signing that form waives their right to enter into any type of class action litigation, such as the Sitzer Burnett lawsuit. Had that waiver been in place prior to these lawsuits, there may have been many less plaintiffs in that case. But this came to us under recommendation of our outside counsel to include a waiver of class action status. So now let's talk about the non-exclusive buyer agency compensation agreement. This is a brand new form. We developed this form because we realized not every buyer is going to want to sign an exclusive agreement with a buyer's agent. The language is almost the same as the exclusive agreement. However, unlike the exclusive agreement, the non-exclusive agreement only applies to properties that are located or shown by that buyer's broker to the buyer. The form has spaces on the bottom to write the different addresses down. If it's not enough space, you can use an addendum. Just remember, if you add additional addresses to the form, you should have the buyer initial those just to make sure that they do consent to the fact that they're included with that agreement. And the disclosure or the compensation section is the same as the exclusive. So let's look at the language of the non-exclusive agreement. The first line just states that the buyer will have to pay a commission if they purchase a property that was located or shown by the broker to the buyer. And the list of those properties located or shown are covered under this agreement, may be listed below or by an addendum. And again, the bottom of the form has a bunch of lines for addresses. And if that's not enough, you can create an addendum for it as well. The compensation section is the same. There's no reason to discuss that. Again, the broker is authorized to have the compensation paid by the seller or listing broker, other than dual agency. Again, if the seller's not offering compensation, the buyer's going to pay it. Or if they're not offering enough compensation, the buyer's going to make up the difference. And again, the rest of this section is exactly the same as it was on the exclusive agreement. NYSAR's amended exclusive right to sell. We had to amend it to remove any reference to required compensation under the MLS, under the previous rules of the National Association of Realtors. And we did some shuffling around and some changing of some language just for compliance purposes, or updating, actually. So I talked about the compensation disclosure. The one for the listing side, a little bit more robust than the other ones were. Again, compensation is not set by law or Realtor Association or MLS, and it's fully negotiable between the seller and the listing broker. An offer of compensation to the cooperating broker who produces the buyer for the listed property is not required. We're telling the seller, you don't have to do this. We thought that was important to include as part of the disclosure. However, seller may choose to offer compensation if they want to, directly or through the listing broker. So we're saying you don't have to do it, but if you want to do it, you can do it yourself, or you can do it through the listing broker. And then last but not least, we notify the seller that they may receive requests for compensation from a cooperating broker as part of the purchase offer or separately, and the seller can accept, deny, or negotiate the amount of that compensation if they so choose. So here's the compensation section. Compensation section is divided up into two separate sections, A and B. A is what the listing broker is expecting to receive, the listing side, shall we say. And section B is for cooperating compensation. So first, listing broker, what is your compensation from the seller if you sell the property? This is what you put down. Again, percentage or flat fee. Now, this second part is what I promised you we'd talk about. So we did include in here a provision in the case of dual, designated, or an unrepresented buyer, where the listing broker and the seller can agree to a different amount of compensation if it's dual, designated, or unrepresented buyer. Now, this amount doesn't always have to be more than what's listed on the first part. It can be less depending upon what the broker's office policy is. Brokers, you need to establish what your office policy is going to be. And what I mean by that is, in the event that you have a dual, let's use dual agency, and you have that written agreement with the buyer, and the buyer agrees to compensate you if they agree to dual agency. Well, you're getting compensated on the buy side, and you get compensated on the sell side. But how do you, if you're getting compensated by both, right? If you're getting additional compensation from both, do you want that to come from the buyer or seller? And you can go back and adjust, again, two parties to a contract, modify those agreements, which is why I mentioned with the buyer agreement, you may decide to modify it and reduce the commissions in the event that the seller is paying pursuant to this specific provision. But again, it does give the listing broker the opportunity to collect additional compensation in the event of dual designated or unrepresented buyers. So you are still getting compensated. But again, it's up to the broker and what their office policy happens to be for that. The terms under which compensation is due hasn't changed, right? If the property is sold through the efforts of the listing broker or a cooperating broker, or if the seller just sells it on their own, compensation is still due and owing to that listing broker pursuant to the agreement. The bottom part, fourth line up from the bottom, you'll see a space. That's your protection period. So in the event that at the expiration of this agreement, the seller sells the property to someone who has shown the property during the term of the agreement, the seller would still owe a commission if it's within blank number of days, 30, 60, 90, 120, 180, whatever you happen to agree to with the seller. And then last but not least, it's not applicable if the seller signs an exclusive with somebody else, which is what the current form states. None of this was changed from what the current form states. So again, this is just for the listing side. What is the listing side getting? So that this is just the listing side. Now, section B is a separate section dealing directly with whether or not the seller wants to offer compensation to cooperating brokers. This is separate and apart from the first part, okay? So the first option we gave sellers is to say that they're not offering cooperating compensation, right? Because that's the whole gist of the lawsuit. So the first thing we put down is that the seller's not going to offer cooperating compensation. If they're not doing it, they skip the rest of this section. But let's say the seller decides that they want to offer cooperating compensation. They can do so. And they initial what type of compensation is going to be through the seller directly or through the listing broker, and they choose one of the two. If they choose to offer cooperating compensation, then they fill out the next section after they initial one of the two options. Now, if you look at the first paragraph, it says, in addition to the compensation offered to the listing broker under paragraph 9A. So let's say the listing broker and the seller under 9A agree to 5%. Then the seller says, well, I want to offer cooperating compensation, and they offer cooperating compensation of 3%, which means they're going to have to pay the listing broker their 5%, and then they're going to have to pay an additional 3% to the cooperating broker, either through the listing broker or directly. But what they're offering doesn't come out of the broker's initial 5%, right? The broker under Section A asks for 5%, they're going to get 5%. And that does not have to be split. That's just going to the listing broker, period. And then Section B would be to cooperating brokers. Now, I mentioned before, nothing prohibits a seller from offering compensation to brokers agents or sub-agents or buyer's agents. They can offer to all three. And they would just indicate here the amount, either flat fee or a percentage. But again, this is in addition to what they agree to under Section A. Now, what happens if the seller agrees to offer cooperating compensation, but the buyer's agent doesn't want it? Then the seller doesn't pay it. Right? The listing broker has no right to collect that cooperating compensation if the seller doesn't have to pay it out. So the broker would still only be entitled to the initial 5% that they agreed to. They would not be entitled to the cooperating compensation because that's only offered to other brokers. So if there's no cooperating compensation being requested or being asked for by the buyer, then the seller doesn't have to pay the amount that they agreed to. I mentioned seller concessions are permitted. We included in the exclusive right to sell whether or not the seller wants to offer seller concessions. If they do, they initial here. The reason why we included this is so that it prompts licensees to have the discussion with sellers about seller concessions. Also because many MLSs are including a field, seller concessions offered, yes or no. And this would, again, give the information from the listing broker to put that on the MLS. Can the seller decide that, listen, I don't know if I want to offer it or not right now. Can I do it on a case-by-case basis based upon offers being submitted? And the answer to that is yes. The seller does not have to decide at the time of listing whether or not they want to offer seller concessions and then are bound by that throughout the entire term. They can decide to do it on a case-by-case basis if they want, and that would depend upon, again, what's contained within the purchase offers they receive. Brokers, I mentioned before about the office policy for dual or designated. If you're collecting extra money on the listing side because it's dual or designated and you're also collecting from the buyer, you can negotiate and determine whether or not you're going to reduce either side or reduce both of them by a little bit. That's up to you, but you have to talk to your brokers about that. You don't have to. Brokers, if you are relying upon the buyer to pay compensation in dual or designated, you don't have to have this section apply where you get extra. But again, that's up to the broker and what their office policy is. And again, don't forget about 175.7. If you're getting paid, especially in dual agency scenarios, you potentially get paid by both sides. You need permission of both sides to do it with full knowledge and consent, including telling them how much you're collecting. So in those scenarios, you have to have that fully informed consent and acknowledgement pursuant to 175.7. So cooperating broker compensation agreement with the seller. So this is if the seller is offering cooperating compensation or if the buyer's agent is requesting compensation directly from the seller, you would utilize this form. This is a one-page form. We made it as simple as we possibly could, so it's not confusing to the seller. But again, like I mentioned, you have to be authorized to collect compensation from the other side. That's included in NYSAR's agreements. You don't have to worry about getting that done separately. You can use it when the seller agrees to pay compensation to the cooperating broker. So you can find that out by going to the listing broker's website or by contacting the listing broker directly to see whether or not compensation is being offered. A buyer broker may utilize the form as part of the purchase offer to request compensation from the seller. So it can be used in a number of different ways. But if you contact the listing broker and they tell you that, hey, the seller's offering, 5%, then you can ask the listing broker to have the seller provide the form to them signed so they can sign it so they know that they're being compensated for that property in the event that it's sold, or the buyer's broker can include it as part of the purchase offer. So it can be used in a number of different ways. Again, it also applies to sub-agency and broker's agency, not just the buyer agency. So if the seller authorized the listing broker to do sub-agency or broker agency, it can be used for that as well. So I'm going to tell you now, I see sub-agency and broker agency not being used as much because by the time a licensee who's representing a buyer contacts a listing broker to see if compensation is being offered, they've already agreed to be the buyer's agent. So if the listing broker says, yeah, we're offering compensation to sub-agency, well, you're calling on behalf of the buyer as a buyer's agent. So you're still a buyer's agent. So you can't change that agency based upon the compensation being offered by the seller. Which is why I think it's going to be used much less frequently than it's used now. And the dispute resolution is the same as other forms. So let's look what's on this form. First thing you do on the form is you indicate what type of agency relationship do you have with the buyer, and you X it out. We put in here that the buyer's agent is not working for the seller. Just let the seller know the buyer's agent is not on their side. However, sub-agency and broker agency, they're working in the seller's or the listing broker's best interest. A little paragraph just saying the seller understands it's just a compensation agreement. It's not an agreement giving the buyer's broker permission to list a property. It doesn't extend beyond the buyer and property that's listed on the form. It's just a simple catch-all kind of boilerplate language. Again, seller understands that compensation is not set by law or any realtor association or MLS, and it's fully negotiable between the seller and the cooperating broker. The compensation section is very simple, just like the other ones, flat fee or percentage. However, on this form, there is a time period. So it's not in perpetuity. So all it states that if the contract is not ratified between the parties within so many days of showing. So compensation's only due if there's a contract in place within so many days of the buyer's agent or cooperating broker showing the property to the buyer. 30, 60, 90, 120, 180, whatever you happen to choose. Cooperating broker compensation agreement with the listing broker. This is a new form. We didn't need to put the compensation disclosure on this. This is a broker to broker form. Brokers know that compensation is negotiable. This form replaces the implied contract you have as part of the MLS. So currently, where there's cooperating compensation is required, okay, you have an implied contract based upon your membership, participation, or subscription, or as being a subscriber to the MLS. As part of your agreement to be a subscriber or participant with the MLS, you agree that when there's offers of compensation being offered, they're unconditional offers of compensation, and that acceptance is made by the cooperating broker when they're showing the property to a consumer, and that implied contract is in place. Once the compensation fields are gone, after your implementation date, that implied contract is also gone. So you need another document to act as the contract between the listing broker and the cooperating broker. And that's what this document does. Now, it would only be used if you know that the listing broker is offering cooperating compensation to a cooperating broker. You cannot use it to request compensation from the listing broker. If they tell you they're not offering compensation, they're not offering compensation because they were not authorized to do so from the seller. So you only use this form if you know that listing broker is offering cooperating compensation. The dispute resolution section is a little bit different because it's broker to broker. So they are already bound by Article 17 of the Code of Ethics to enter into the arbitration process. So that dispute resolution section is a little bit different. But let's look at what it says. Again, who is the buyer's agent, who is the cooperating broker representing? Buyer, sub-agent, or broker's agent. We don't need to explain the different types of agency on this because, again, this is a broker to broker form, right? Both parties know what this means. Listing broker understands that it's just a cooperating compensation agreement with the cooperating broker for the property that's listed on the form. Again, how much is the compensation, percentage, or flat fee? And again, the contract has to be ratified within so many days of showing, 30, 60, 90, 120, 180. That really hasn't differed that much. And again, dispute resolution refers specifically to Article 17, where you agree to mediation. If mediation is not offered, straight to arbitration, or if mediation is offered and you don't come to some resolution, then you shift to arbitration. But since you're both brokers and both members, you would have to comply with Article 17 of the Code of Ethics. The last slide are what resources are available to you. Again, NYSAR's guide to complying with the NAR settlement, NYSAR's statewide forms and a guide to using the statewide forms, NYSAR's antitrust lawsuit resources. And again, I mentioned before the NAR site facts.realtor. And again, you will have a copy of this presentation for yourself at the conclusion of this. So, questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So going back to the page where it's differentiating between, dual agency and dual agency with designated sales, because all of this language is it all seems fairly straightforward if you're talking specifically with a broker, but within a brokerage, right, there are frequently, right, there's two different agents on either side. So one question is there a way to have an addendum that separates off that, right? Like if it's directly dual through a single agent, it's a certain percentage versus, two separate agents who have to get paid two separate amounts, right? Like, is there a way to have that be two different amounts?
Nothing prevents a brokerage from modifying the forms.
Nothing prevents them from modifying. Okay, so we can add like an addendum on the back end that says like in the event of, et
Correct.
cetera.
Yeah. Pursuant to paragraph 9B, shall now be amended to read as follows. In the event that it's single dual, it's this. If it's, I'll call it double dual. But if it's two agents in the office, it's this. Yeah, you can do that if you want to.
Okay.
We did think about all those different scenarios, but by the time we tried to make a document out of it, it became way too complex trying to take into consideration all the different possible scenarios that are out there, which is why it wasn't included.
Okay. And then one secondary question. So going back to the somewhat contentious question of earlier of the you know, what and what wasn't policy and or practice prior to this regarding you know, a buyer directly contacting a listing agent regarding making an offer, is essentially then, because this is because we can say, basically, if we say like the listing, look, the brokerage gets 5% regardless, we could basically then in the addendum say, you know, that if a buyer is a, you know, customer, we can sort of work out discretion there, correct? So basically we could say the selling brokerage gets 5% regardless, and then if it's brought by another agent or another brokerage, we could reduce our amount to 2.5%. In order for the seller to compensate a compensating brokerage, correct? And that would sort of cover us in the event that you're not getting a buyer's agency like percentage.
I don't follow.
So typically right now for within my brokerage, we between 5 and 6%, and we would share that in half. But now we're saying essentially is that, well, what you said is that has always been policy, but clearly through conversation has not been practice. Is that if someone comes to say my open house and wants to submit directly through me, previously in practice, if there was a 5% that was said it was going to be shared, right? In that scenario, the seller has been up to this point still paying it, whether or not that was what the law intended. That's what happened in practice. The seller was paying the full 5%. So now we're saying is that if someone comes directly to us because we don't have a buyer's agency agreement with them, we would only be entitled to the 2.5% that's being designated to the seller because we don't have a buyer agreement. That's
except that in that second paragraph under A, you can put down a different amount of compensation under that scenario.
So we can still be compensated. We're just not representing them as buyer's agents.
Correct. So under 9A, the first, let me hold on a minute.
I think that was sort of what was unclear a bit earlier was where like all that worked.
Let me share the screen here. From current slide. So if you see under A, right, this is the base amount that the listing broker wants to collect on the sell side. Okay. Now, the second paragraph here that's highlighted, this is in the event it's dual designated or an unrepresented buyer. So this can be a different amount. So let's take your scenario where you previously offered 5 and hypothetically it was a 50-50 split. The broker kept 2.5 and they gave 2.5 to the cooperating broker. So under this first paragraph, you're going to list 2.5 because that's what the seller side was going to get. However, in the event there's an unrepresented buyer, dual or designated, you can ask for more than that 2.5%. You can ask for the 5, hypothetically, and say, if it's this situation, you're going to owe us 5. So you can get that additional compensation using that second paragraph, you know, if there is an unrepresented buyer that is permitted.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Stopping my share again. You should see all the windows open on my desktop. Sorry about that. Anybody else have any questions?
I do.
Go ahead.
So you had mentioned CMAs. If you're working with a seller and you have a customer, the customer must request a CMA. You don't ordinarily supply the CMA.
Sure. No, you wouldn't just have them handy like, oh, by the way, you're a customer. Here's a bunch of CMAs. But, you know.
Okay. I thought there was a change.
Yeah. No, but we know that they will say, well, how much should I offer? Well, I can't tell you how much to offer, but here are comparables for the neighborhood to help you make an informed decision about how much you want to offer. That's pretty much how it works.
And my second question is, in the past, if you were not a member of our MLS, I always supplied a commission agreement with a non-realtor broker. So a licensee that was not a member of our MLS or a non-realtor, I always had a separate agreement. That still remains in place, correct?
Correct. Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Jackie?
Hi, thank you so much for a great presentation, by the way. Quick question. So when I go on to One Key and I go into forms and documents, and I don't know if this is for Mary or for you, But under one key on the forms, are all the new forms going to be listed like new forms? So we know which ones are correct and which ones aren't, or do we have to go to NYSAR and pull the forms from there?
I just want to say, Jackie, I did send them out to membership the other day. I did send you an email. I sent it to everybody of all the new forms. So that way you don't have to worry about which forms to use. I sent you all the correct forms. So if you check your inbox, you should find them. I'll send them again though.
Okay, thank you. And then, so another question, is there and I know this is gonna sound silly, but a step-by-step, okay, if you're listing, you need this form, and this form, just so we're all crystal clear of the new forms that are required? Like I guess like a step-by-step, if you're taking a new, buyer, these are the forms you need. That way.
So
we're all crystal clear.
I don't have one. And the issue with that, I'm just going to tell you, is that different MLSs have different requirements as far as voluntary forms, as I call them. So there's no, we don't have one on the state level.
Okay. And Mary, do we think our MLS or our board will have that list, just so we don't miss any of them? I mean, with all the different forms coming out and the addendums, I just want to make sure that all the forms are done correctly.
What we can do is we could just make the forms available, but we can't predict what scenarios are going to take place.
That's really, Mary, if I may, that really is up to your broker.
Okay.
That should be part of the broker training.
Okay, and the last question. So on the buyer's side, you said on the bottom of the form, all the places that I've shown them. I normally show people, one day and then they don't like any of those and I show them another day. I just keep the addendum and they just initial all of those as I show them.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't anticipate you to know every single property you're going to show when you enter into that relationship with the buyer. That's impossible. So yeah, you would just add them to the addendum, have them then initial and date the changes.
Okay, thank you.
Or you can do a new addendum for each day, right? You don't have to keep putting on the same addendum. Just do a new addendum for each day if you want to. And again,
Okay.
I know it may be cumbersome, but this is your guarantee of getting compensated, right? So you have to be and pay attention to it.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? No? Okay.
Anthony,
thank
I want
you.
to thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
very, very much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for your time and for clarifying these difficult issues. We appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for caring enough for coming and learning more about the settlement. Again, I think that it's going to make trying to explain it a lot easier for those individuals who didn't take the opportunity to attend today's session. So again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate it so much.
Sure, and have an enjoyable weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great vacation, Anthony.
Thank you. Yeah, I will. Trust me.
And thank you, everyone, for participating today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Suffolk County Board of Realtors. Hi.